From the moment the first Allied boots struck the beaches of France, soldiers had fought day and night to tear an iron wall of bunkers, machine guns, and fanatical German defenders. Hundreds had fallen, but now, at last, that wall was crumbling. The Reich was losing its grip, pushed back one village at a time. The country was nearly free, except for one place. Pressed against the Rhine, a final pocket of German resistance remained standing. A few thousand exhausted soldiers dug into the shattered town and snow-choked woods, fighting with whatever ammunition they had left. The Allies marched forward, expecting an easy win. But as they crept closer, something about the silence ahead felt uncomfortably familiar. If Normandy had taught them anything, the Führer had something up his sleeve. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals leaned over their maps in grim silence. Months of relentless Allied pressure had turned the Western Front into a nightmare. Paris was gone. City after city had fallen. And now the Americans and French stood just west of the Rhine, one final river crossing away from Germany itself. The Führer had placed his hopes on the Ardennes offensive, a desperate last attempt meant to split the Allies and buy his forces some time. But as his commanders briefed him on the status of the campaign, the future of the Reich looked bleak. Across the Ardennes, hundreds of German tanks lay gutted and burning. Thousands of infantrymen had either lost their lives, been captured, or scattered under the pressure of the Allied march. Hitler refused to concede, calling his troops to keep the fight alive no matter the cost, telling his commander, "There is not a matter of prestige involved here. It is a matter of destroying and exterminating the enemy forces wherever we find them." Most German units no longer had the strength, ammunition, or manpower to deliver the counterblow the Führer was demanding. And yet, against all odds, in the heart of Alsace, in eastern France, one German formation had still managed to hold firm by turning a pocket of villages and medieval towns into improvised fortresses. This was the Colmar Pocket, the last German stronghold west of the Rhine that threatened to claim thousands of lives and stall the Americans' advance if they attempted to capture it. Still, the Allies knew that if they managed to break it, nothing would stand between them and the gates of Germany. The Colmar Pocket stretched roughly 40 miles across and pushed 30 miles deep into the region. For troops who had already marched hundreds of miles since landing in France, it should have been just one final push. But winter had arrived in full force, and if the stubborn German defenses ahead weren't enough of a threat, the weather would ensure these were some of the most punishing miles the Allies had faced since Normandy. The opening strike fell to French General Émile Bethouard. His French First Corps was ordered to hit the southern edge of the pocket head-on, drawing German reserves and clearing the path for a northern thrust to encircle the enemy and seal off every escape route. The moment Bethouard's men advanced, it became clear just how tough this fight would be for him and his men. A violent blizzard swallowed the battlefield. Visibility collapsed to just a few yards. Whenever a French or American soldier glimpsed a German silhouette through the swirling snow, frozen fingers trembled too violently to steady a rifle. In places, the snow rose to a man's waist, turning every step into a slog that left the attackers exposed. The situation was no better for tank crews. Though protected from the wind inside their armored hulls, they could barely crawl forward. Mines were scattered across the fields, buried under the blinding white, and making any movement a gamble. In the opening days of the battle, more than 30 tanks were hurled into the air by hidden charges crews never even saw coming until it was far too late. Still, the Allied advance did not stop for a second. Infantry waded through partially frozen rivers, pushed across open ground, and infiltrated any gap they could find before the Germans could seal it. By the end of the first day, despite the storm, some units had clawed forward as much as 6 miles. But before the Allies could push any farther, the rumble of engines echoed across the snow. Over 60 German tanks were surging forward, about to unleash a fire meant to stop the Allied charge once and for all. By the time the snow curtain finally lifted from the battlefield, the Allies were already staring straight into the wall of advancing German armor. Cannon fire flew across the fields, sending men scrambling for cover, their bodies slamming against frozen earth so hard it felt like stone. However, there was no running now. For the Allies, the only chance of survival was to swing their weapons toward the advancing panzers and fire with everything they had. The Nazis were relentless, unleashing a storm of shells that tore through the snow-choked landscape as Allied soldiers darted desperately from one patch of cover to another. But every time the Germans fired one round, the Allies answered with a dozen. The American and French soldiers outnumbered the Nazis by hundreds of thousands across the entire campaign, ensuring that no matter how many men fell to German fire, there was always another fighter ready to step forward and take his place to keep the attack moving. By the time the Nazi cannons finally fell silent, 7 German tanks had been destroyed and roughly 100 enemy soldiers were taken prisoner. However, victory in the south meant nothing unless the rest of the forces pushing through the Colmar pocket managed to close the encirclement. In the north, men had begun moving just 2 days after Bethouar's opening strike in the south. Some of these units had almost no heavy artillery support to soften the German defenses ahead, pushing forward, armed with little more than snowsuits, rifles, and inflatable boats, battling through ice-crusted rivers and frozen fields as they advanced toward Neuf-Brisach, the vital German supply hub that kept the entire pocket alive. For American Commander Major General John Iron Mike O'Daniel, there was only one way through the Nazi-ruled woods and villages ahead: a non-stop, rolling assault. Each regiment would smash into German positions, neutralize them, then immediately rotate out with fresh troops pushing from behind, never giving the enemy a moment to regroup. Despite fierce resistance and countless ambushes, Iron Mike's strategy worked, and by January 25th, the Americans had fought their way to the edge of Riedwehr, only 10 miles from Neuf-Brisach. From here, the Allies were ready to launch the final assault. The Allies hurried into position, careful not to make a sound that might give away their presence. But before they could deliver the decisive strike, the unmistakable crack of enemy fire tore through the silence. The Germans were already counterattacking. Bullets and cannon shells erupted from every direction as the Allies tried in vain to reach the town ahead. Dozens of men fell before they could even fire a single shot. The fighting became savage, with no amount of Allied effort seeming enough to break through. Lieutenant Audie Murphy of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division would later recall, "As we advance, the fighting developed into individual duels. Only a few yards separated us. We snipe at one another, but neither of us scores a hit." Murphy was one of the lucky ones. In just a few hours, every officer in his company had become a casualty, leaving him alone to guide the formation forward. But even he couldn't see a path ahead. Rather than expose his men to further slaughter, he ordered them to fall back into the woods while he climbed onto a burning American M10 tank destroyer and opened fire with the vehicle's .50 caliber machine gun. He knew it was a gamble, but if his men could be spared from a massacre, he would take it. As the rest of the troops escaped, German fire converged on the lone lieutenant. Bullets and shells tore across his position, yet he kept firing, mowing down wave after wave of attackers. For nearly an hour, he held them off alone. Only after the Germans finally pulled back did Murphy, wounded and exhausted, rejoin the remnants of his unit. His leg was injured, but he refused to stay behind. The advance had to continue. With German resistance broken, Allied troops finally surged forward, reaching Neuf-Brissac and liberating it by February 6th. Meanwhile, in the south, the Allied push never slowed. Town after town fell as soldiers fought for every mile against entrenched German positions. The battles were brutal, but by February 9th, the Nazis had nothing left to stop them. The diverse Allied units that had fought across the sector finally linked up, completing the encirclement that collapsed the Colmar pocket and wiped out the last German foothold in the region. With France fully liberated, the road was clear for the Western Allies to drive toward the heart of Hitler's empire. Months of fierce fighting still lay ahead, but Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front was over. From here on, it was only downhill for Hitler and his Reich.